looking back at what may seem to be ancient history for some, and what some may feel should be ancient history, the 1980 presidential campaign, many of you may remember that one of the key issues in that campaign was the federal budget and what to do about it. Here in Oregon, during that same period of time, we were stuck in one of the deepest recessions in recent memory, and many of us felt that the federal budget deficit was one of the major causes of that prolonged recession. Then we were told that Gramm-Rudman would solve all of our problems, that we didn't need a balanced budget amendment, that in fact what we needed was these limits placed on the spending, and that Gramm-Rudman would do it. Now, unfortunately, it seems a weekly occurrence to read in the newspaper or hear on television news about discussions between the President and Congress on how to get around the Gramm-Rudman limits. Throughout this period, some have urged the passage of a balanced budget amendment. Our speaker today was not among those people. Representative Peter DeFazio is Oregon's 4th District Congressman. In 1977, University of Oregon graduate, he began his political career by working for Congressman Jim Weaver in the 4th District. He later served on the Lane County Board of Commissioners between 1982 and 1985 and served as chair in his last year and tenure on that commission. He is currently serving his 2nd term in Congress. He sits as a member of the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee and is also on the Public Works and Transportation Committee of Congress. He is here today to discuss the social and economic impacts of the federal deficit and the national spending, and the continued deficit spending and the breakdown of congressional budgeting process. His speech is entitled, whatever, I left my title. Science Fiction, A Progressive Democrat's Close Encounter with the Balanced Budget Amendment. Would you help me welcome Congressman Peter DeFazio?
As he was reviewing the topics of the next 2 weeks, I was thinking, drugs, the issue of the war on drugs, legalization, the drug scourge in this country, or the issue of reproductive rights after the Webster decision. Those are certainly the things that generally headlines are made of, and most people can be called, to participate in politics to work their will or their opinion on issues like that, or even something maybe more symbolic but equally inflammatory, such as flag burning. But I chose today to talk about something that generally sort of puts people to sleep and engenders snores in the audience, talking about the folks with the green eye shades, the Office of Management and Budget, and how the federal government builds its budgets, and why I finally, after a number of years of feeling that it was unnecessary, have come around to sponsoring the constitutional amendment to balance the budget. And I was the 243rd person in the House of Representatives to sign on as a co-sponsor of that bill. Of course, you need a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate, and 2/3 of the state legislatures concurring before such an amendment could go into place. We're confronted, when we go back to Washington next week, immediately with wrapping up the budget for the next fiscal year. A budget that's supposed to show a deficit of around $80 billion. Fact is, we're going to get there, probably, but we're not really going to get there. We're going to get there with smoke and mirrors and phony estimates. Right now, in fact, we're confronted with the possibility, if we were honest about our situation, of having Gramm-Rudman implemented. Now, I still don't support the principles of Gramm-Rudman, that is, across the board, indiscriminate cuts in every program of the federal government. I think that is the worst possible way to reduce a budget, because you reduce the programs that have no utility and are wasting money the same percentage as the programs that are starving for money and where we need to be investing more of our dollars. So I'm still not a fan of Gramm-Rudman, but I have come around on the balanced budget amendment. And if you look at the numbers, the Congressional Budget Office has said we should have Gramm-Rudman sequestration this year. I think it would be a disaster. But the President's Office of Management and Budget has managed to cook the figures, assume interest rates that anybody in this room would love to borrow at as prevailing in the economy next year, and make other assumptions that bring us within the targets. That drama or that farce will be played out in the next month. Since 1981, since the beginning of the Reagan era, we've accumulated over $1.5 trillion of new debt. Interest payments on the debt alone this year or next year are projected to total around $160 billion in interest payments. That's 10 times the amount of money that the federal government spends on all functions of education in the United States of America. We're spending 10 times that amount of money just to make debt service on past borrowing, and we're accumulating more debt as we go. The end of this month, we will be faced with lifting the debt limit of the United States to over $3 trillion. That issue will be before us the end of this month, and that's when I think we have a unique opportunity both to deal with a balanced budget amendment and to deal with other budget reforms that are necessary that I'll get into a little bit further into my speech. You know, people say, why should I worry? It seems that you know, given the fact that you know, federal government isn't in balance, but the economy's cooking along pretty well. We're pretty prosperous here compared to where we were 6 years ago. Very prosperous down in my part of the state compared to where we were 6 years ago. Why should we worry? Well, for one thing, you know, our national policies are now being colored more and more by how we're looked at in the world economy. Oftentimes I hear when we're dealing with legislation, what will the Japanese banks think? You know, well, we're passing legislation that affects the people of the United States of America. We have to worry what the Japanese banks think because we're worried that they won't come in and purchase our Treasury securities. Almost 30% of our debt on an annual basis is being purchased by foreign entities and foreign governments, and all that interest money, of course, is flowing out of the United States. How did we get to this point? The question, you know, there are those who say, people much more cynical than I, that this was intentional on the part of Ronald Reagan and the right-wing ideologues that he brought with him into the White House, that their intention was to spend us into such a bind that it would cause the dismantling of FDR's programs, the social programs that America had adopted through the 46 years after the Great Depression began up to the time Ronald Reagan took office. It doesn't really matter whether it was intentional or not intentional. The fact is we doubled our debt, a debt that it took more than 200 years to accumulate in 8 short years, and we almost quadrupled the annual interest burden on the people of the United States. It's put us into a virtual deadlock in Washington, D.C. The competing priorities within the budget are such that if we were realistic about dealing with our budget priorities and the deficit and our revenue needs, the landscape would be very different, but we don't. We just shine it on an annual basis because no one wants to upset the economy or no one wants to upset the political body, the people of the United States, that much by telling us some of the tough things we're going to have to do. Our savings rate is at a record low and a low in terms of all the industrial nations on Earth. Productivity here in the United States over the last 20 years has grown at a rate of about 1% compared to 2.5% since from World War II up until the early 70s. There are those who would blame labor, organized labor, or working people of America. I blame the lack of investment in the educational system and training system we need, the lack of investment in the productive capability of the United States because we're diverting so much of our money into non-productive purposes such as interest on the debt or into military spending. You know, we're worried again, as I said, about the impact of any decisions we make. We're always got our eye overseas now and have lost a good deal of our international leadership, having become the world's greatest debtor nation in the last 10 years, from having been the banker of the world, the creditor of the world since World War I. You know, I think that Senator Moynihan was right on target when he said that history will record that during the 1980s, the United States borrowed $1 trillion from Japan and threw a party. Unfortunately, now we're getting into the hangover phase of that party, and we have to begin dealing with some cures. We have to stop the binge first and then begin to deal with the cures. I would say that most people in Congress would say Moynihan's right, but it doesn't seem that the will to do something about it follows the recognition of the problem or the reality that we're confronted with. We're still hiding the true extent of the deficit behind counting tricks by including the trust funds in the federal budget and underspending those trust funds intentionally, even though those are earmarked taxes that can only be spent for one purpose. Social Security, Federal Aviation Administration Trust Fund, Highway Trust Fund, even though we have incredible needs in terms of roads and bridges. Bridges right here in Oregon, our bridges along the entire coast are in need of substantial rehabilitation. We have airport problems. We need runway extension in the city of Eugene. We've got problems here in Portland dealing with the increased capacity of the airport. We need an air traffic control system. The money is in those trust funds to do that. We've paid the taxes to do it. But because the way we're creating smoke and mirrors with the budget, that money won't be spent for the purposes for which it was intended. It'll be used as a burgeoning surplus to make the deficit look a little bit smaller. We're deadlocked right now. I mean, we're really playing, I think, a very cynical game, and the question is, when will we not be able to play that game anymore? Will we ignore this reality until things are much too far along to ever come out of it on a sort of a gentle glide path as opposed to some sort of catastrophe? The congressional budget process, very obscure. The Budget Act of 1974 pretty much set the ground rules for what we're doing now, and the best analogy I could use is it's a little bit like the myth of Sisyphus, that you're pushing the rock up the hill and you get to the top of the hill, goes down the other side, and you begin the task again. And since you're behind that rock until you get to the top, you can't distract yourself. You can't do anything else. That's what the situation we have prevailing in the United States Congress. We're on a 12-month budget cycle right now. Every year we struggle and fight to meet the deadline of October 1st to implement all the authorizing and appropriating bills, and 2 times out of the last 15 years that target's been met. And in all those other 13 years, what we've adopted are temporarily expedient budgets. My first year in Congress was a real lesson in this. We finished the budget for the United States for the fiscal year that was to have begun on October 1st, 1987, on December 23rd at 1:30 in the morning. In 1987. You might ask, well, how did we run the government during those interim 3 months? Well, we ran the government with continuing resolutions, that is, stopgap measures, things that had virtual no legislative scrutiny. And when we finally did adopt a budget on December 23rd at 1:30 in the morning, it was another continuing resolution. It was a continuing resolution that was about 2 feet high, contained thousands of pages, and I can tell you truthfully that no one in the United States Congress knew everything that was in that budget, nor did anyone on our staff know everything that was in that budget. It was thrown together in conference committees. Things surfaced later, like the money for the French schools, for refugees from Algeria that have been put in by Senator Inouye that caused a public outrage. There were other things that came out during the year. These things were not known. They were not publicly debated. They were not included through any sort of regular budget or authorization process, but because of the crush, because of being behind that stone and having to get it over the top of the hill so we could go home for our Christmas recess, people were willing to ignore that and say, thank God, stone's over the top, and we'll come back on January 6th and start pushing it up the other way again. So we have virtually no time to focus on what I consider to be the most legitimate function of government for the 1990s and beyond, and that is oversight. It's a very legitimate congressional function, a power given to us by the Constitution. We don't only set up the programs and appropriate the money. We're supposed to monitor their conduct and review the expenditure of those funds and decide whether or not those programs should continue to exist, whether or not they should be modified, whether their budget should be increased, decreased. We should be going through all the programs of the federal government like that in order to root out the waste and the problems in the federal budget. But that is now like the Dogs and Cats Committee. That's the first, when you're lowest on the totem pole in committee seniority, you get the Oversight Committee. And you try desperately to find something to do with the Oversight Committee because most other members of Congress aren't interested in it, and you're only interested in it as long as you're stuck as chair, and then you move on up to the next committee, which you feel has a more important function, creating some new programs that we can't afford. What's the solution to that? Well, I would say that the solution to that is to move the Congress to a 2-year budget cycle with a mid-year correction, a midterm correction after the first year in terms of revenues and outlays. But get us out of this total focus on just pushing the rock up the hill, watching it roll down, and begin pushing it up again as soon as we reconvene. Spend more time on oversight. Spend more time reviewing the functions. Apply the expertise of the authorizing committees. Don't vest all the power in the Appropriations Committee. You know, the Appropriations Committee, and thank God Les O'Coin and Mark Hatfield serve on it, because it is, at this point, the most powerful committee in Congress, and it does determine pretty much where you stand in line for federal dollars, and they've been tremendously helpful to Oregon. But you know, we were never really intended it to be that way, to have what's called in the House the College of Cardinals. The chairs of the subcommittees of appropriations are called the College of Cardinals, because they wield so much power, because we are so obsessed with the budget process and the annual roll of the stone up the hill, that they are now taking over also the legislative function, not just appropriating the money, but they're also taking over the legislative function, becoming a Congress within a Congress, which is difficult to penetrate. That was never intended. If we move to a 2-year cycle, the authorizing committees, the committees with expertise in the areas of public works or public lands, interior, and that, can begin to use that knowledge to review the programs of the federal government, to review where the money's going and how we're spending it, and I think we can do a much better job. So that is at least the beginning, I think, of the reform of the budget process, and I've advocated that since before I was elected to Congress. And we may get there in the near future. I've been named to a special select committee, a short-term task force, really, by Leon Panetta, chair of the Budget Committee. We're going to meet in September, and we're going to offer, in the end of September, some proposals to reform the budget process. And one for me would be to move to the 2-year cycle. You know, the straw that led me to being here today and talking to you about the balanced budget amendment really happened during this year's debate over the Armed Services Bill. You know, on an annual basis, it's for me, the 3 years I've been there, it's a very depressing time, because you see vote after vote where common sense does not prevail, nor does fiscal restraint prevail, but pork barrel and special interest prevails. One of the first amendments I got involved in the defense field 3 years ago with Ted Weiss from New York was to stop the Trident D5 missile. Now here's the story. We've got Trident submarines. They have missiles that work, C4s. C4s can land within about 1,200 feet of their target, and they can carry 8 to 10 hydrogen bombs. That means that one Trident submarine can carry enough hydrogen bombs to wipe out every city in the Soviet Union with more than 100,000 people in it, cities the size of Eugene and larger. One Trident submarine, just one. These missiles work. We've tested them. We've even fired them from underwater. Well, the Pentagon said, that's not good enough. We need new missiles for those submarines, the oldest of which is 5 years old. We need the D5 missile, because the D5 missile can land within 400 feet of its target, 800 feet closer. Imagine that when the nuclear fireball occurs, that, I mean, you would have another nanosecond to think about it before you were vaporized if it was only a C4 missile that got you. And what's really important about the D5 is it's a first strike missile. That is, it has silo busting capability, and of course we've said that we would never strike first. So then why do we need them? Why do we need to land within 400 feet of the target? And why do we need missiles that will carry another 2 to 4 hydrogen bombs? And of course, on top of that, if you've been watching the news, they don't work. They made a little error. They forgot they were going to shoot them through water. They work great on land, but when they go through water, they're too big. It happens that they're 5 inches bigger in in diameter than the C4 missile, which means not only is it going to cost us several billions dollars more to develop these missiles, it means we have to take the Trident submarines, which we just launched over the last 5 years, out of service, rip the bows apart, and put in missile tubes that are 5 inches wider so we can use these new missiles that don't work, all for the cost of only $7 billion. Now, if we, as a society, were, just awash in money, or there was some real military necessity for these weapons, I would think that would be a reasonable thing to do. But we don't need them, and we can't afford them. What happens when Ted Weiss offers the amendment? We get 96, 98 votes to not build the D5 missile. This year, the issue was the MX versus the Midget Man missile. Now, you might remember the MX. It's a missile in search of a home. They said, gee, we have to have mobile missiles. President Carter was going to run them around the desert on, racetracks, and that got canned. So we built the missiles anyway, and we put them in the silos that we said we had to get the missiles out of because they were vulnerable. And now we're saying 10 years later, well, we got to look at that again. So Ronald Reagan had raised the idea of putting them on railroad cars, because everyone knows the trains don't run on time, and the Soviets could never figure out where they are. So that proposal surfaced, but then Boeing came up with an even better idea, which is sort of your small garden variety missile called the Midget Man, which would actually fit in this room, which could be hidden anywhere. I mean, you could hide it in a barn. You could hide it. I mean, just imagine the places. I mean, people could have midget men in their own backyards, disguised in their swimming pool or something. The Russians wouldn't have the slightest idea where the missiles were. So we had these two competing proposals, ignoring the fact, of course, that we already have 1,200 land-based missiles. We already have, some 5,000 submarine-based missiles. We already have, 100 B-1 bombers, 450 B-52 bombers that have been upgraded. We have cruise missiles. We have all these other things. But they said, we need a new missile. I don't agree, but okay, at least if we're going to go forward with a new missile, let's have maybe just one. And that was what the last Congress decided. They finally said, we really cannot afford two new missile systems at the cost of $50 billion each. We can only have one. The new president must decide by March 31st. March 31st rolls around. George Bush looks at these two systems. He says, gosh, I really like both of them. And, does the Congress have the guts to stand behind what it did only a year ago and say, no, you have to make a choice? No, the Congress said, well, gosh, Mr. President, if you like both of them, we like both of them. So let's build both of them. So yeah, it's only $100 million this year for development of the Midget Man missile. But after you spend $100 million in Congress, next year when we come back to try and kill it, they'll say, wait a minute, we already spent $100 million. If we stop spending the money now, the people would be angry. And I say, no, people would pat you on the back for once if you stopped spending the money and admitted you made a mistake. It's not in the cards. So after that, I got to tell you, I left the floor after going through the bill this year, and I just came to the realization that the will does not exist within that body politic to make the tough decisions that need to be made to get us to a balanced budget, because too many oxes are going to have to be gored in too many districts. And it's a very cynical process, like Star Wars. The Star Wars, there's an association of contractors. They had as an objective to get Star Wars projects in 218 congressional districts before Ronald Reagan left office, and they did it. So they felt that they were basically insulated for the future. It doesn't matter whether the program works. It's political engineering is what the Pentagon calls it. That is, you make sure you spread these projects around. Even if it makes it less efficient, you got to have the votes. There's a great book called The Wild Blue Yonder on the B-1 bomber, the thing we've built that doesn't work. The B-1 bomber was built as a manned, low-level, penetrating bomber. The problem is that in order to find its targets, it has to turn on an electronic array, which makes it light up the Soviet radar screens like, hit me right here. Here I am. And they can't fix it. Plus, it has problems flying at low levels, too. It crashes. But, we built it, but if you read this book, you'll read there was a 30-year struggle to kill it. And there were significant parts of the military that felt that we shouldn't divert all of our resources into that weapon. And they were right, but they didn't prevail. 3 presidents tried to kill it, and it just rose like Dracula from the grave and went forward. No one ever managed to get the wooden stake in the heart. So, and what does that matter? Well, we're spending over 6% of our gross national product on the military. I believe a rational look at our military commitment would allow us to spend much less. The fact is our competitors around the world, the Japanese are spending less than 1% of their gross national product on the military. The Germans are spending less than 3% on theirs. And you got to wonder why we're falling so far behind in civilian technology and competition and international trade, and why we're running a trade deficit. That's a big part of the problem. 75% of the federal government's investment in research and development is going to the Pentagon to develop these things that we really, in many cases, don't need, and they don't really work. So that was it. I left that debate, and I said to my staff, I think there's a balanced budget amendment pending. Get me a copy of it. I want to read it. I read it. It said, sounds reasonable to me. I called in some interest groups, National Taxpayers Union and others, and some of the sponsors of the bill to talk to them. I do have some reservations about how it's drawn. In particular, what do we do in times of economic crisis or emergency, national emergency? There's a 60% provision. That is, 60% of the members of the House and the Senate can vote to override the balanced budget. That's not too many. I think that if we had a real problem, you can get 60% of our elected representatives to realize that, but I'm hoping that that's enough to prevent them from doing it on a routine basis, so we don't keep on piling debt on debt. It would be phased in. It would not occur until 1993, which is when the Gramm-Rudman targets say we'll balance the budget in any case. Then we have some very real problems in terms of dealing with the trust funds. How are they counted or not counted in this? How do we deal with long-term federal investment? There's some details to be worked out. But I think we need to make the push. We need to push in that direction. So the solution I offer is, one, require the President to submit a balanced budget in alternative between now and 1994 so we can get in practice. Ronald Reagan talked a great game, as was alluded to by the Speaker, about balancing the budget. He said he'd balance it by 1982, and they said he'd balance it by 84, and of course he never submitted a budget that was anywhere near in balance. In fact, the total sum of Ronald Reagan's submitted budgets exceeded the deficits created by the United States Congress during those years. Yet he used to say, give me a balanced budget amendment. It was sort of like, stop me before I kill again kind of thing. Now he's a great advocate of it, and he really wants to see it happen. Now he's out. 2-year budget cycle that I discussed, and finally, balanced budget amendment. We're not bankrupt as a country yet. I am bullish and optimistic about Oregon and the United States. We have a gift of more resources, natural resources, and a more educated population than virtually any other nation on earth. A tremendous infrastructure. I think all the seeds are there for the United States to be the free world leader through the next century, through our third century. But I don't think it's going to happen unless we take the credit card away from the United States Congress with a balanced budget amendment. Thank you very much.
We now come to our customary question and answer period. We will have a mic set up here shortly in the center of the room for oral questions, which will take precedence. If you are shy and wish to submit a written one, please hold it up so the staff can pick it up. Our first question today comes from our board host, Cheryl Warren.
It's refreshing to hear a member of Congress admit that the body is somewhat grinding to a halt, and I applaud you for admitting that. I wonder how much sentiment do you think exists for the biennial budget proposal that you mentioned, and what trade-offs do you think you would have to make to achieve it?
Well, the interesting thing is there's a little weekly magazine on Capitol Hill, used to be sort of in disrepute, but actually is becoming fairly reputable, called Roll Call, and they did a poll of the members of Congress last year, and they found that about a 70% majority of the United States Congress support a 2-year budget cycle. The problem is we got a few very powerful committee chairmen and leaders, the College of Cardinals and others, that don't want to see that happen, because Jamie Whitten, for instance, if Les heard me say anything bad about Jamie Whitten, he'd kill me, because Jamie could cut us off in a minute. But Jamie Whitten, the chair of the Appropriations Committee, was elected to Congress before Pearl Harbor, 6 years before I was born. And this gentleman does things his way. If you ever heard Jamie speak, it's the only word I can understand is he goes, more America. And every once in a while he says America. He's from the South, but he wouldn't allow microphones in the appropriations room until last year, because power is people didn't know what he was saying. He'd say, or move the question. Everybody goes, yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, whatever. So Jamie Whitten and others do not want to see the system change. The majority does. Can we overcome that inertia? I think we have to. I think, in fact, the beginnings are there. When Leon Panetta, the chair of the Budget Committee, which has traditionally not been very powerful, calls for the formation of a task force to propose changes to the budget in this budget cycle, I think we're on the way, finally. So I'm hopeful it'll be this fall, and if not, I think it'll be in the near future. Yes, sir.
Richard Tracy, member. As you clearly point out, over the past decade, we've been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. But to get our economic house in order, they're going to take some major adjustments in the way we do business in the country. Specifically, what kind of adjustments would you recommend in our expenditures for defense and for entitlement programs and other programs? And number two, do you believe additional revenue is also necessary, and what kind of taxes, if yes, what kind of taxes would you recommend?
Well, we'll spend the next hour on. In terms of how I would deal with the military, there's first of all, I mentioned or alluded to the level of commitment of our allies. If there's a real threat in Europe, my question would be why do the Germans and others spend so little of their money on defending Europe? Why do they only have 2 weeks supply of conventional ammunition? Why do we spend so much? So one principle to look at, or one thing to look at, is the deployment of our forces overseas. To look at the idea that we have to maintain the capability of fighting 2.5 major wars at the same time. Basically, we say we will maintain a military capability to fight 2 World War IIs and a Korea at the same time. I don't know who those enemies would be. There aren't enough in the world, but it may be an invasion from outer space. So I think we can look very realistically at the commitment, look at the strategic capabilities we've developed. I believe there's a real opportunity to negotiate with the Soviets for mutually verifiable reductions in both conventional forces in Europe and strategic forces. They're in deep, deep economic trouble, much worse than we are. And I think that they aren't coming to the table out of idealism, they're coming there out of pragmatism. And I think we've got some real opportunities. So I would look at all those sorts of commitments. The entitlement programs, we passed a major reform of welfare in the last year, which I think will have a strong impact in the future, similar to the plan adopted in Massachusetts, which is to develop a program to provide the wherewithal for people to get off of public assistance, to put a real emphasis on education and training and recognizing the fact that particularly for single parents who are stuck on welfare, that in order to get the education and training, the 2 things they need are health insurance for their kids once they go back to work in low-wage jobs as they work their way up, and they need some help with child care to get through the education. All those things are components of the welfare reform. I think that we're going to see a decreasing burden on the federal government for welfare as this moves through the system. The other things that people like to point at and call entitlements, such as Social Security, I have a little different philosophy on. My background's gerontology. I'm somewhat of an expert in Social Security, and Social Security is a separate trust fund, and it's set up with FICA taxes. In fact, it's running an increasing surplus. It's programmed to have a surplus of over $2 trillion in the bank by the year 2005 in order to pay benefits to the baby boom, because it's a social compact between generations. I don't consider reducing cost of living adjustments or other things in Social Security if the money is within the Social Security Trust Fund. I don't think that should be counted as part of the general fund budget. So that's one big entitlement that a lot of people like to talk about. I consider that to be separate because of its trust fund nature. Revenues. I think that what we need before we ask the American people for revenues. I tell you, I'm not, at the moment, if someone said to me, I'm going to raise your taxes to pay for this mess, I'd say no way. First of all, I mean, we do need to make the tax system more fair. We now have a system that goes 15%, 28%, 33% for upper middle income folks, and then when you get over $140,000 a year, it goes back down to 28%. First time in history, we have an explicit lower tax rate the more you earn. I'd reinstate those people up to 38%. That would be about $8 billion a year. Well, that doesn't solve the deficit, but it's a start. But more than that, before I did any more or any equitable across-the-board request of the American people to help with revenues, I would first spend a year or 2 on the oversight and the rooting out the waste, because quite frankly, the American people are very cynical about government now. They don't want to pay more taxes if they think it's being wasted. If they were convinced that Congress had done a good job in cutting the budget, and we still had a deficit and it was important to reduce that deficit, I think at that point we could ask for some sort of fair across-the-board increase in revenues, but not before then.
Congressman and gerontologist DeFazio, I'm Poppy Warren from Good Samaritan Hospital, and I'm director of a multi-million-dollar federal demonstration project for the provision of services to victims of Alzheimer's diseases and their families or other caregivers. Over 68,000 people in Oregon have Alzheimer's disease. I understand you were recently appointed to the House Select Committee on Aging. What are your plans and visions for dealing with the problems of the aging?
Okay. I feel that it's inevitable that this country adopt a rational system of national health insurance as soon as possible. The system we have now doesn't work. The patchwork system, Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, and then 38 million people have no health insurance whatsoever. Yet we're spending 11.5% of our GNP on health insurance. our health costs. And in Canada, they spend 6.5%, and everybody has health insurance. I'm not saying we can adopt their system wholesale. We have some differences in our philosophy and our medical system. It wouldn't fit entirely, but we can do a lot better than we're doing now. So moving toward a affordable system of national health insurance, particularly one that provides for in-home care coverage for seniors. I'm like to cover long-term care too. It's a very expensive item at the moment. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to deal with that. But if we have a good in-home care service first, I think we'll cut down a lot of the need for the long-term care. We need to do a lot more emphasis on preventative health rather than, emergency health, which we have now. I mean, a lot of seniors stay away from the doctor until the problem is full-blown because when they're in the hospital, they can afford it, but when they're not in the hospital, they can't afford to pay those costs to the physician. So health care is a real priority with me. Secondly, I've recently become aware through a statement by someone in the Comptroller General's office that testimony before the Senate just before I left Washington. He said that the next scandal in this country and the next $100 or $200 billion bailout is going to be the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund because there are a lot of failing pension plans out there. I think that requires immediate attention. Part of it has to do with leverage buyouts and takeovers and other things where these plans are being dissolved and then being underfunded. Part of it has to do, with other aspects of the law. So income security in general, including private pensions and protecting Social Security by moving it out into the status of an independent agency outside the normal federal budgetary process. So income security and medical care are two of my highest priorities on that committee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Richard Pope, member. A lot of people, some economists would argue that we don't need a balanced budget because of the rosy economic picture today. I'd like you to give me some estimate of what you feel the proportion of that rosy economic scene is a result of the deficit.
Well, it sort of goes back to Moynihan's statement about borrowing the money to throw a party. I can't, I studied economics as an undergraduate, truthfully, until I finally came to a revelation sometime in my senior year, and I thought about it. I said, this really isn't a science. This is actually, I had been fooled by my professors to that point. So I really don't understand what makes the economy work except a lot of faith, for one thing. And I think that faith is getting more and more shaken by the burden of debt. If we were going in as a homeowner with this ratio of debt to our equity and or our annual income, I think a banker would have a hard time loaning us money to buy a house. So, the federal government has to start to live within those constraints. I don't know how much of the prosperity is due to that. I would say some proportion, which is also why I say we can't balance the budget next year. We've got to phase in a balanced budget because we're somewhat addicted to that borrowing and that additional cash flow. But we just can't keep it up. Yes, sir.
I think it's too bad that you stopped your studies of economics when you did. It was a bit too soon. I don't see the logic in much of what you have said, I'll be frank to tell you. Mm-hmm. Let me just ask one question where I don't understand your point, really. You say that the major function of Congress should be to act as an oversight committee over the nation's government.
I said a major function, not the only, but yes.
All right, a major function. On the other hand, you say that the trust funds, which were established to extend runways or to build highways or to do other things, should remain outside of the budget. In other words, should not receive any oversight. The money that's there should be spent.
No.
As I understood it, you said that the trust fund, for example, the one that takes care of airports.
Yeah, outside, there's something called the Unified Federal Budget, which was created by Lyndon Baines Johnson during the Vietnam War, and the idea of the Unified Budget was to hide the deficit for the Vietnam War. So he said, we have never considered trust funds as part of the budget, now we will. He moved in Social Security, FAA, and the Highway Trust Fund. And so then they began to make the deficit look smaller. They're dedicated taxes, they can only be spent for one purpose. We would not remove congressional oversight. The money would still be appropriated by Congress on an annual basis and would still be subject to the 5-year highway reauthorization by the Public Works Committee on which I serve. But on an annual basis, we wouldn't allow the President to basically underspend those funds and accumulate an increasing surplus in those funds when we have real needs for new air traffic control systems, for new highways and bridges. We wouldn't allow an increasing surplus. In fact, on October 1st, the tax goes away that accumulates into the FAA trust fund unless the President makes a commitment to begin spending those trust fund monies. That was something passed by Congress 2 years ago. That's what I mean, and that's the intention I have. We don't remove all oversight or all. Congress has to, by the Constitution, appropriate funds. So.
Isn't it a function of oversight to decide every year whether the money needs to be spent or whether it does not need to be spent?
That's correct.
If it doesn't need to be spent, why spend it? And isn't this a judgment that the Congress should make every year, or the President should make every year, instead of setting aside a kitty which willy-nilly has to be spent to extend runways or to build bridges, which may or may not, in any given year, be necessary?
Well, there is a very well-documented study done under the Reagan administration, and Freeman Homer from Eugene was one of the 8 people or 7 people on the panel, which showed that actually the total money that we'll collect into the trust fund for highways and bridges, in fact, will equal about 1/2 of the need over the next 25 years. We have bridges today that are condemned and unsafe in the federal system. If you've driven on the roads back east, the so-called interstate highways, and gone through one of those 2-foot potholes, you know what I'm talking about. You break an axle. The need is there. If the need isn't there, which is what we've done, we said if the need is not there, if we don't need new air traffic control systems, if we don't need extended runways, if we don't need new airports, Mr. President, and you're not going to spend the money, then the tax goes away. And that's what I believe, and that's the way we're handling that. We're not just saying spend the money. We're saying there are real needs. This is what we think the money should be spent on. If you don't want to spend the money on those things, then you don't need the tax, and the tax goes away until those trust funds are spent down on real needs, and then in the future, if we need it, we'll raise the tax again. So, you know, I think we have more agreement than you realize. Yes, sir.
I'm Ray Polani, member of the City Club. Congressman DeFazio, I think you indicated the awful size of the federal debt, 2.6 trillion going up to 3 trillion. But isn't perhaps that we, the American people, are part of the problem? What is the size of the private debt? What is the size of the corporate debt? I think if you put those together, even the federal government isn't doing as much, I think.
I can't give you those figures offhand, but you're correct. I mean, our savings rate is, aggregate 3% compared to 8% in many foreign nations. We are a very consumptive society, and we do need more, I think, incentives to cause the American people to save. And right now, the tax system is not set up in such a way as to do that. Corporate debt is even worse. I'm sponsoring legislation that would take away all the tax benefits that follow with debt leverage buyouts. It's a sickness, what's going on right now. Our productive capacity in this country, when Michael Milken is the hero of Wall Street, because what does he do? He specializes in putting together deals to buy profitable corporations with debt, dismantle them, saddle them with a huge new debt burden so they no longer pay federal taxes, which is exactly what's happening. Corporate taxes are dropping dramatically because profitable corporations are being given such a high debt ratio, which is tax deductible, that they're not paying taxes anymore. That's the other side of leverage buyouts. So the corporate debt is growing by leaps and bounds, and many of these corporations will not be able to survive. Good corporations, good profitable corporations previously profitable, will not be able to survive an economic downturn. And Congress doesn't seem to have the guts either to deal with leverage buyouts. We were told pretty explicitly after the crash on Wall Street that Congress caused the crash because it was considering legislation to restrict leverage buyouts. And if we ever consider restricting leverage buyouts, there'll be another crash. I don't think that's what caused the crash on Wall Street, personally. But, there is this real fear of dealing with that problem. That's, yeah, and that has to change to some extent. So, have I answered all the questions? We have some more time.
Oh, no, we have lots more questions here. Would you please give us your evaluation of the new House Speaker, Tom Foley?
Okay. Well, for the first time in the history of the United States, we have a speaker not only from the West Coast, but from the Pacific Northwest. And I think that is going to be I think, of tremendous benefit not only to our region but to the nation. I think Tom Foley represents some of the best in what I would call progressive democratic populist politics, someone who takes a little bit different view than maybe the traditional democratic establishment in the East of the problems of the country by tempering that a little bit with some of the more independent thinking West Coast, particularly Northwest ideology. A man of great integrity. I think that we will not suffer any more scandals while Tom Foley is Speaker. And, you know, I've got to say, you know, I tried to get onto the Aging Committee as the only person with a professional degree in gerontology in the Congress for my whole first term and into the beginning of this term, and Speaker Wright kept promising me I was #1 on the list, but strangely enough, other people got on before I did. And when Tom Foley got on, he promised me a seat, and it so happened the first seat was Claude Pepper's, which is tragic, but I got it. And I think he's also a man of his word, which I think is something we really need in Washington, D.C. We need a lot of people in leadership positions who are true to their word, and Tom Foley's one of them. So.
Chip Greening, member. You've said that Congress has a very difficult time making the tough decisions, having the will to make those decisions. What makes you think that a 2-year budget cycle is going to change things? Based on past performance, Congress has simply procrastinated in making the budget decisions through the use of continuing budget resolutions. Why won't Congress do exactly the same thing again, procrastinate, use continuing budget resolutions to eat up the entire 2 years as is done with a 1-year cycle?
Well, that's another reform that I neglected to mention, which is I'm a sponsor of legislation that would say that any continuing budget resolution cannot exceed 60 days in length, and it cannot exceed the previous year's appropriations for any of the agencies. Basically, it would be a true freeze in the budget. So that would be a key. What you need is, you need a package, and the package is, as I said, submission of a balanced budget by the President, and I neglected to restrict continuing budget resolutions in that manner or some manner close to that, 2-year budget cycle, and the balanced budget amendment. You need a package. Not, any one of those things will not do the job. You need at least those 4. There may be other things that we need too. But that's I neglected to mention the restriction of the continuing resolutions. Yes, sir.
I'm Austin Leach, City Club member. I'm really discouraged by your several times mentioning today that the Congress didn't have the guts to do a balanced budget. Isn't it about time that perhaps individuals be selected to take the function of that oversight committee? People who are not running for re-election, that are specialists in how to deal with financial projections and the consequences, and share that information directly with the people. I think the information we're getting from Congress is diluted. They don't have the guts. And I suggest that it's time for the citizens to take that function and give edicts. Question mark.
Thank you. You know, I don't know exactly. I have never heard the proposal similar to that. I don't know exactly how one would work it out under the constraints of the Constitution. That in itself would probably require a constitutional amendment, what you're suggesting, given the allocation to Congress of the powers of the purse. But you know, I'd be happy to entertain any and all ideas. I'm not saying that what I offered today is the only way we're going to get to a balanced budget. There's a lot of ways. I'm not a font of knowledge. I'm just offering an idea to provoke some discussion and also a path that I'm following. So.
How would a Congress that can't handle its annual budgeting process now deal with the past balanced budget amendment? What kind of battles would you foresee should, say, tomorrow we had a balanced budget requirement that would go on internally within the Congress?
Well, I would see battles being joined that aren't being joined now. I mean, there's an awful lot of deals cut to, you know, if you allow my program, I'll vote for your program. You know, we would have to get truly down to the priorities of the people rather than maybe the priorities of the policymakers in taking care of, you know, their own political pet projects. I don't mean to pick on the Pentagon, but they do spend over $300 billion a year, which is a lot more than any other agency of the federal government. I think would make some tough choices between weapons programs, as opposed to saying we want them all and stretching them out over time, which ultimately costs more, which is what we're doing. We would have to decide at the front end what we really needed and choose those programs and say these are the programs we're going to build, and we're going to build them in this time period, and these have to fit within the budget. And I'd look at the similar thing in the Department of Agriculture and some of the other major departments of the federal government. We'd have to do a much better job of setting priorities, which we're not doing now. Yes, sir.
Alan Oliver, member. Do you favor a longer, say a 4-year term for the representatives? And if so, how might this affect the process that you're talking about today?
I would look at, if I were rewriting the Constitution, I would look at 4-year terms for members of the House. 2-year terms at this point in time are frankly, extraordinarily expensive in terms of election and disruptive in terms of just the one term I've been there, the one full term. There was a big difference between the first year and the second year in terms of substantive legislation. The second year is election year, and it's very different. I would look at perhaps 3 4-year terms, limiting to 3 4-year terms, members of the House. That's controversial. I certainly wouldn't want to say that Claude Pepper or other people with long service didn't contribute a phenomenal amount, but on the other hand, I see a lot of people who are holding their seats who are just holding up space. They've been there too long. They become sort of inside the beltway politicians. Then to match that, I'd look at 2 6-year terms for the Senate and probably leave the president where it is. But that's just, it's just my idea. I'm not working on that. I'm not about to tackle that constitutional amendment when I'm working on this other one, but that's just my idea. So,
where would the initiative for that kind of movement come from?
Basically, from the people. You'd have to, see that there is, a groundswell of support and move forward. I think people are getting pretty tired of the 2-year election cycle, the amount of money that's spent on campaigns, and some of the problems that causes in terms of ethics and other things. They'd like to see restraint on spending, restraint on campaign practices, and one good way to get there is to make the campaigns at least a little less frequent and put more regulation on them. So I think it's just got to grow from the grassroots, or a group of members in Congress who decide to really push for it. And Tom Carper, I think, from Delaware, has introduced such an amendment, but at this point, it's not receiving serious consideration.
Andrew Wheeler, a member. I don't think Sisyphus ever got the stone to the top of the hill.
Well,
and there are some people who say that a balanced budget is really just a sounding good idea. And I guess before recently you were not for the balanced budget. What changed your mind?
No, I was for balancing the budget, but I thought it could be done without forcing it upon the Congress. I believed that we could, as reasonable people, as elected leaders of the people, agree on priorities, make the difficult choices, and get us to a balanced budget. I have never advocated an infinite deficit budget. I have always said we need to balance the budget, and I felt we needed to phase in a balanced budget by the early or mid-1990s. So all I've done is say I don't think that the method I thought would work, which is reasonable discussion and tough decisions being made by the Congress, is going to work, that we need to impose some structure upon the Congress from outside, which is a balanced budget amendment.
We have time for one more quick one here. You may soon have the opportunity to vote on a capital gains tax reduction. How do you plan to vote on such a measure, and what impact do you think capital gains tax reduction would have on the federal budget deficit?
Capital gains proposal pending, Ed Jenkins' proposal from Georgia, is about the worst possible way of dealing with capital gains. I believe there is a legitimate need for long-term capital gains treatment to encourage long-term investment. Les Aucoin has a bill pending that would treat particularly gains over a 5-year or longer period very favorably. Ron Wyden has a bill pending that would treat timber more favorably. Right now, there's very little incentive for private individuals to grow timber. Those are needed. We need some inducement to productive investment. Ed Jenkins would be a one-time 2-year reduction in the capital gains tax, which means during that 2 years, everybody who had some sort of capital gain would be very likely to exercise it, which would mean instead of inducing long-term investment, it would induce dumping of capital investments. It would increase the deficit. after that 2-year period. It would decrease the deficit during that period because people would be paying more taxes, albeit longer term they would have paid more taxes under the present system. So I would adopt a truly long-term targeted capital gains proposal, but only after we reinstate the tax bracket for the people at the top, the ones who earn over $140,000 a year, put them back to the 1987 rate of 38%, and then give them, say, a capital gains rate at 28%, and give the people in the 28% bracket, say, a capital gains rate of 18%, and give the people in the 15% bracket maybe a capital gains rate of 10%, so that all the people in America, regardless of your income, can share in some of the benefits and also be induced to invest some money in the future of this country and the future of the industrial infrastructure in this country. Right now, the estimates are under Ed Jenkins' proposal that 80% of the benefit of his capital gains proposal will go to people with incomes in excess of $200,000 a year, and it wouldn't engender long-term investment, and it would increase the deficit. I think that's a mistake. So, thank you very much.
I want to thank Congressman DeFazio for that interesting and insightful address. In particular, I am looking forward to the opportunity for the City Club to invest in a Midget Man missile. I didn't know we had missiles our size, but we've certainly been needing one here at the City Club. I hope you will all come back next week for Allie Stickney on the politics of reproduction here at the Benson Hotel. We are adjourned.